Ladies and gentlemen, to be the last in a row after a long day of fruitful scientific debates and just before the reception and the Zurich lecture bears its risks and chances. Let's concentrate on the second. To speak late means usually get memorized. In this last session, we want to focus on the aspect of society. What makes it prosperous, and how does culture and cultural dimensions influence success or failure of a society? Let give me you some thoughts about this. Presumably, most among us here today are descendants of a Western civilization. We may believe that democracy, the rule of law, or federalism are essential factors in shaping a successful society. That is the case if you look at Switzerland, Germany, or the United States. But why is then China, a one-party authoritarian state, on the way to become the most powerful nation in the 21st century? And why have India, in respect of its population, the biggest democracy on earth and one of the fastest growing economies, still not been able to overcome its caste system and the vicious religion divide that hinders the success of millions of its citizens? To cite Max Weber's famous thesis about the work ethics of Protestantism, you may think he has a point when you look at the developments since the Euro crisis. Haven't been Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, or Ireland the living proof of the divide between societies with a predominant Catholic orientation, heavily indebted and obliged to see support by the northern part of Europe, a cluster of countries with a predominant Protestant or even Calvinistic tradition? Arguing that, however, how comes that Bavaria, where the acting government just ordered the hanging of the crucifix in all public buildings, is one of the most successful entities not only within Germany but globally? Or that the above-cited Ireland has regained much of its economic strength just within a couple of years? Or how comes that the majority of the 50-plus states on the African continent still struggling, and yet some of them have seen a quite successful development in recent years, regardless that they share a common history of colonization? We live in a world of divide, and at the same time we live in a world of global convergence. Collective values have become fluid, as individualism and hedonism are seen as elements of liberation and progress. We heard today that aggregated individual behavior forming culture, like the appetite to take risks or being patient, may explain existing and non-existing cultural differences between societies. But how does culture influence modern societies? Is it just a matter of our destiny, or can it be shaped by ourselves? And how important is it among many other factors for the rise and for the fall of a nation? What also makes a prosperous society? We will debate that with two guests of outstanding qualification. Sir Paul Collier, sitting in the center of the panel, is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford and a Professorial Fellow of St. Antony's College. His research covers the causes and consequences of civil war, the effects of aid and the problems of democracy in low-income and natural resources-rich societies, urbanization in low-income countries, private investment in Africa infrastructure, and changing organizational cultures. Apart from his distinguished academic career, he served as a director of the Research Development Department of the World Bank. He is currently a Professeur invité at the Sciences Po in Paris and the director of the International Growth Center. Opposite sits Alan Posener, the British-German author and journalist who published several well-received bio and monographies about quite different characters like John Lennon, John F. and Jacqueline Kennedy, Elvis Presley, William Shakespeare, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Maria, the Mother of Jesus, or Pope Benedict XVI. He's a well-known commentator and the editor at the Welt and Welt am Sonntag newspaper and known as a very dedicated debater. Both gentlemen have an international background. Sir Paul's father emigrated from Germany to England. Alan Posener grew up in England, Malaysia and Germany as the son of, I quote, a German Jew with sympathy for Christianity and an English-Scottish agnostic with a flair for astrology. Before we start, let me ask you, the audience, a simple question on the snap vote by your personal smartphone. And you have to put in again the code. And the question is, do you think that culture can make a society successful? So, do we have the result already? It's a simple question. That looks quite clear. Okay, so let's start. Sir Paul, let me start with your vastly praised book, The Bottom Billion, although it has been 10 years, more than 10 years now that it has been published. In this book, you explore the reasons why impoverished countries fail to progress despite international aid and support. And you marked 4, you call it traps, major traps, explaining why nearby 60 states are being so unsuccessful. The trap of civil war, the trap of being rich in respect of natural resources, the trap of being landlocked and surrounded by poor neighbors, and the trap of being badly governed. Surprisingly, you did not highlight culture as a specific trap. Why?
Because I didn't know enough then. I just spent this last summer doing the, if you like, the sequel to The Bottom Billion. It's called The Eye of the Needle. And now a centerpiece is culture. The last 10 years, I've educated myself in the sort of the new economics of not of individual biases, but there's a new economics of group cultures, and I'm now sort of part of that intellectual movement, and I think that's now very important. The sad feature is that most of the Bottom Billion, even though the last decade was a pretty kind decade for them, they still diverged from the rest of mankind. Mm-hmm. A handful of countries managed to transform, and I think, in effect, a dysfunctional culture becomes a trap, and it's hard to escape from that. I've just done a report with Tim Besley at the London School of Economics, very distinguished economist, and our studies of what's called fragile states. Mm-hmm. And so the report is called Escaping the Fragility Trap. And the centerpiece of that is the idea that you're in a syndrome and it's a cultural trap, basically. So,
when you say it's a cultural trap, or it's also a cultural trap, Alan, to bring you in, how important is it? I mean, is it the key factor? Is it the major trap? Or is it one among different traps, as Sir Paul just mentioned in his recent book?
I'm kind of disconcerted because I was all revved up to tear into the bottom billion for not mentioning culture.
Sorry.
and now it's supposed to be a disputation, and now I'm high and dry. Look, you mentioned you mentioned Max Weber and the ethics of Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, 1904. So it's not exactly a new idea, been around for a long time. And the problem always is that's always with hindsight. It's always looking back. Most of the predictions Max Weber made were wildly wrong on the basis, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a great sociologist. It just means that I think that's what sociologists and economists do. But,
I was going to say, you missed our impeccable record.
Exactly. I mean, but obviously, culture. We could, if we could do an experiment, we take a population of people with a certain culture, and we'd have to define what that is, but maybe, and then we plonk them down in a place where they've never been before, and where people around them have a completely different culture, and see how it works out, also relative to the people who lived there before. Now, this seems like a wildly implausible experiment, but it has actually been done, and it's called Zionism. And there were predictions about this. For instance, a guy called Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf wrote that if the Jews ever established a state in Palestine, it would be a refuge for rogues and a university for rogues. He based this on his analysis of Jewish culture. Now, in fact, what has turned out, it has not been a refuge nor a university for rogues. It is the only functioning democracy. It is a wildly successful country which has transformed itself from an exporter of citrus fruits to an exporter of software. For instance, no German car would run without Israeli software. And I don't mean the tampered software in Volkswagen. They did that by themselves. That's German efficiency. And by the way, and that's interesting, a multicultural society, because in fact, you hardly find a single country in the world which is more diverse than culturally than Israel. I mean, the majority of the country is secular, and they despise the Orthodox Jews who despise the secular Jews. And then there are the people from Iraq and Yemen, and they have virtually nothing in common with the Yeke, with the people from Germany. And then there are the Russians who, in the first generation, mostly don't speak Hebrew. If you go to Haifa, you go into a shop. You have to speak Russian, otherwise you're done for. And then there's, so what constitutes a culture? And it's a really interesting question. And in the case of Israel, I'm sure it can be answered very easily. It's the ethic of the elite. I'll maybe come back to that. We have an elite in Israel which has an incredible work ethic, an incredible fighting ethic, an incredible commitment to the country. Mm-hmm. And although there are black sheep, think of Netanyahu's son, he is a black sheep precisely because he's an exception.
We heard a lot of definitions today, or learned a lot of definitions today about the notion culture. When you listen to Alan, would you agree? And is the thesis of it is a concept of an elite generalizable for other countries as well, or is that an exception?
I think let me give you my conception of what a culture means, and we can then try and apply that to Israel to see whether it fits or not. But Ernst Fair emphasized shared norms. Right? That's one part of a culture. But he also emphasized a particular sort of subset of norms, which is this conditional norm, the norm of reciprocity, basically. Mm-hmm. That seems to me the the fundamental healthy norm in a society, the idea that we'll do this because we expect others to do it. And in order to build that sense of reciprocity, you need two other ideas that become a package of a culture. So one is this norm of reciprocity, but then you need a sense of shared identity, because otherwise there's no domain for the reciprocity. And you can have lots of subcategories within a shared identity, and Israel does, but you've got to have some overarching sense of we, because if you don't have a sense of we, there is no domain to reciprocity. And then the final thing is you've got to have some sense of purpose, if you like. If we all do this, then this good thing happens. And people have to believe all three of those in order for the system to be self-reinforcing. Now, building that structure of beliefs, I call that a belief system, a norm, a shared identity, and a causal proposition. If we all do this, good things happen. Building that system is very hard. The societies where I work, most of the time, haven't ever built it. They're just riven by bitter oppositional identities with no shared we above them. And so the domain of reciprocity just applies within this subgroup, a tribe. And then here's power, which is the nation, and what is our group going to do? It's going to try and capture the state and plunder the state for us. And so all the reciprocal norms work at this subgroup level instead of at the common level of the societies I work on, the structure of power in the society is very different from the structure of identity. Power is at the nation, highly centralized nations, all the revenue goes to the center, and identity is much more broken up. And that combination is deeply dysfunctional. There's two things you can do about it. You can either move power down to identity, which is what Switzerland did, or you move identity up towards power. But if you don't do either of them, your society doesn't work.
In your newest book, just out a couple of weeks now, and it's still not available, unfortunately, on Kindle. So you can order it. It will be out on 4th of December or something like that.
18th of November, I thought.
Or, no. But never mind. The Future of Capitalism. Professor Collier. You analyze the deep new rifts that are tearing apart the fabric, to quote, of Britain and other Western societies. Flying cities versus the provinces, the highly skilled elite versus the less educated, wealthy versus developing countries. So this is a critic now on well-established cultures, well-established democracy. What does it mean? Is globalization destroying these kind of cultural values you just mentioned and just elaborate?
Destroying is too strong a word, but it's threatening them. And all my working life, I've straddled, first and foremost, the divide between desperately poor societies riven by these rivalries of identity, and our own societies, which were working so wonderfully. But I've also straddled the two new divides that have opened in our societies, one which is a spatial divide between booming agglomerations, London, Frankfurt, Zurich, and periodically broken...
Sheffield.
Yes, Sheffield, where I grew up. So I grew up. You've all familiar with Sheffield and how it got broken. You've just forgotten that the film, The Full Monty, which you've nearly all seen, The Full Monty is about Sheffield. That was a 700-year-old steel industry that was broken in a 5-year period as a result of globalization. Right? And then there's another divide, which is a new class divide, certainly new to Britain, which is Britain's always been a class-divided society, but it used to be divided by inherited position. Now it's divided by education. It's the people who've been to university and the people who haven't. And so, I've got almost as much university coming out of my ears as Professor Fair, but both my parents left school when they were 12. So all three of these divides I happened to, by chance, straddle. Mm-hmm. And just to answer your question about what's happening in our own societies, I feel we've been very complacent. We sort of believed that there was some magic gold dust which made the West infinitely superior to all the pitiful little countries, which is where I work. And no, there was no magic gold dust. We just successfully built this package of shared identity, reciprocal obligations, and a sense of purpose, a shared purpose, which the societies I work on haven't yet done. They'll have to go through that struggle, and some of them have done it. But we seem to be at the early stages of going into reverse. That our shared identity is coming apart because of these new vicious divisions.
But would be a recipe to rebuild this kind of we feeling, this kind of shared cultural values, the reciprocity you mentioned at the beginning, a kind of, let's phrase it, Leitkultur, like we have the discussion now in Germany again. Is that the recipe to bring back this kind of we feeling?
Well, you can ask me?
Yeah.
Because Leitkultur, leading culture, this is not about creating a we culture, it's about creating a us versus them culture.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you see how it's defined, for instance, the people who try to define it from the right, they say, when we meet, we look each other in the eye and we shake hands, which means that a Muslim woman who's veiled is outside of this Leitkultur, which means a Muslim imam, and by the way, an Orthodox Jew who won't give a woman, who won't shake hands with a woman, is also outside of this Leitkultur, although they are obviously part of our society, and so on and so on. Germany is notorious for defining itself via culture. Probably because it was so late in defining itself as a nation, and even then defined itself as being culture versus French civilization, fought a whole world war about it, whose it ended 100 years ago. So, no, don't go down that path. I did learn, actually, I think it was the phrase you used, inclusive nationalism. I think it was from you. This is the opposite of Leitkultur. I mean,
absolutely,
it's the Israeli. I mean, the Israelis were in a way.
What does it mean? What does it mean? Inclusive nationalism.
Well, let's take the extreme example of Israel. It means, firstly, they're very lucky they have an enemy that wants to kill them. They have 200 million Arabs who are constantly being roiled up to eliminate the state of Israel. That means they're in a constant state of not imagined danger, like we from an imagined Muslim invasion, but from a real invasion. Secondly, they came from, of course, a terrible tragedy, so they were knitted together by that, whatever else they had. Thirdly, as I said, they have an elite which is dedicated to Zionism, whatever else they may disagree on, and they disagree very strongly. And thirdly, they built institutions like, for instance, the army. Now, every Israeli boy or girl goes to the army for 3 years. I mean, it's completely unthinkable in Europe, and I don't want to recommend this as but this is the place where actually the ideals of the elite sort of filter through to sort of the young Ethiopian Jew or the young Iraqi Jew or the son or daughter of the Muslim Russian immigrants. And there are even now some Arabs joining the IDF. So we don't have to go that. So if you take that as the sort of paradigm, still working, of course, we don't. That's not. Neither are we threatened the way Israel is, nor do we possibly want to have that level of inclusive nationalism. But if you sort of take it down a peg and ask ourselves, in Europe, do our schools function in that way? Are they really inclusive, or are they filters to filter out people? Do our politicians try to instill? Okay, you get the idea.
This is going to be very dull because we were supposed to have a dispute.
Yes.
Everything you said, I agree with that.
Oh, damn.
But let me try and fill it out. Maybe I'll tread on your toes somewhere. You have to build a sense of shared identity. If power is at the national level, which to a large extent it is, you have to build some sort of sense of shared identity at the national level. The question is, how do you do it? What criteria do you do? And what's nationalism? I've even given up on the word, frankly. I now call it patriotism. But,
yeah, okay, you got too much flack.
Yeah. But, well, I didn't get flack, but it's been so effectively appropriated by Trump, the word nationalism, that there's no space left, as it were, what's happened is that the sense of nation has been captured by a group that doesn't mean nation, it means our bit. Right. And it uses that aggressively to say you're not part of the nation, even though these people are citizens here. So how can you build a sense of shared identity without doing... the idea of shared values as a source of shared identity sounds great until you ask, what do you mean? Yeah. And it always means my values shared, right? Mm-hmm. And you just have to use your brain to realize that's not going to work. You're never going to be able to get Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders to agree on any single value, and ditto, and yet they're both Americans. And so what's the basis that you can actually use for shared identity? And I think there are two that I suggest in the book. So one is a shared sense of belonging to place. We're all, we grow up in the same town, we belong in the same nation, whatever it is. Place is a sort of onion that stretches out. And we know that sense of attachment to place is very, very powerful. It's actually hardwired in our brains, a sense of territoriality. Mm-hmm. There's one nice little bit of evidence I put in the book, which is the ratio of attackers you need in order to defeat defenders, which has been constant across human society, human history, at 3 attackers to displace 1 defender, because the defenders, this sense of belonging. And it also turns out it's constant across a whole range of species. So it's not even something that's developed in humans, it's developed in species. So shared belonging, that's one thing. And the other thing is shared purpose. Shared purpose around, if we all do this, then that. And Adam, you spoke about the shared purpose in Israel of we better hang together, otherwise we'll all be dead. And of course, that was built in Europe with these international wars. But you've got to have some shared purpose other than fear.
But we are talking about what makes a prosperous society. So take China. I mean, you have nationalism, but I wouldn't say that's inclusive. Take Turkey. Very nationalist, not very inclusive.
Okay, let me push back a bit on that. I think China, it's not fully inclusive, but it's what is the shared purpose in China? Surely it's we want a strong China. We've been humiliated over the last century, and now we want to get out of that with a strong China. It seems to me that the whole narrative, black cat, white cat, which was just saying, never mind, we'll be pragmatic about how we do it, but we've got this common purpose of a strong China, and we better all pull together. And that seems to me to be describing China, and it's rough at the edges, and I don't want to apologize for the roughness at the edges, But that's really what's binding it together, and it has been remarkably successful in lifting the mass of the population out of poverty, no question.
Yeah, I think, and again, I do think it's a question of what the elite does. I mean, I always argue in Germany that I say, well, you know, let's not talk about, do you wear a burqa, do you wear this, do you shake this person's hand, do you visit the mosque or the church? The question is, do you follow the law? And that's the main reciprocity. If you feel that the people on top basically follow the law and are basically fair with, you know, Volkswagen fiddles with your exhaust system, but, you know, then there are people who actually blow the whistle on them. And so if you feel that, you know, we've heard this a couple of times, then you're going to feel also that you belong. Yeah. Now, I don't think that in China this feeling is going to last for long. And there's whole swathes of China where that's simply not the case. I mean, in talking about Tibet, they're talking about the Uyghurs, where the Chinese government has this incredible idea of, or practice of putting supervisors in every family, a person who sits in the house and sort of monitors what people are saying. How long is that going to work? I mean, it's probably going to work for another 10 years or 20 years, but sooner or later, this concentration on the Han nationality rather than China has to break down. And since the Han themselves are killing themselves for not having any children and aging, this is actually quite good news for the Uyghurs and other people, and also for the West, by the way. So, and also for Africa, which has been colonized by China, and so on. So I'm not actually. I mean, I was actually quite a fan of Deng Xiaoping, but, you know, I'm not really afraid of China.
So, two things. One, I'm a pragmatist in the sort of late 19th century American tradition of pragmatism. It doesn't mean make it up as you go along, but it means it's in contrast to an ideology. That there is, to my mind, there is no state of utopian perfection which is sort of written down in a textbook, and that's all we need. We have to, pragmatism says, understand what's the context now, work out what's best now, and it'll run for a while, and at some stage it will break down. And that's my view in China. They'll need to rethink, but it's worked very well in lifting the population out of poverty and despair, and, you know, at some stage they will have to rethink. It'll burn out. All these things burn out. I've now understood what you mean by elites, and again, boringly, what I now think you mean by elites, I sort of agree with, because I use the term leaders, and elites I think of as a gang that's separate from and somewhat oppositional to the rest of society. So I don't like elites, but leaders. And you're leaders, but leaders think that your main job is command. You've got the power of decision, and that's your core job. And I don't think that is your core job. I think any leader with any reasonable ambitions their ambitions are way beyond their power of command. And what they need to build is willing compliance. And to build willing compliance, you can't do it by command. And so, to my mind, leaders are not commanders-in-chief, they're communicators-in-chief. And they communicate in two ways, what they say and what they do. And both matter. Economics has been pretty feeble on the power of what people say. And there was a famous Oxford philosopher called J.L. Austin who came out with the concept of speech acts. And the key word there was acts. Speech acts and visible acts, you know. That speech was an action. When you make a promise, it is an action which has changed the material world. It's changed how people will behave. And economics has been a bit slow on developing a proper theory of how to use speech acts to reset behavior to build compliance. But a good leader uses both speech acts and visible acts, and they work together. The speech acts are good at defining precisely what you mean. The visible acts are good at building credibility of what you mean. And so intelligently used, the speech acts and the visible acts reinforce each other. Of course, if you get them wrong, you tear the two apart.
Is that because you have been such a fierce critic of Chancellor Merkel concerning the migration policy in Germany?
Well, if you like, I could broaden my critique. I think she's been very short-termist. So I think of her as a sort of populist more than a pragmatist. A pragmatist actually has some theory that they're working on. So let me give you 3 examples of Merkel, the short-termist. So one was, and probably by far the most important, was the reaction to the onset of the euro crisis, in the banking crisis in 2008-9, where the other leading politicians in Europe, Britain and France and Italy, all said, this is a banking crisis, we've got to do something about it collectively. And if you read Adam Tooze's book, Crashed, which is fabulous, new history of that crisis, by far the best analysis of it, you know, literally, she and her finance minister would not pick up the phone. And then they don't do anything. Sure enough, they get a banking run. And then unilaterally, the Chancellor announces, we'll guarantee all bank deposits in Germany. That, again, unilateral action, that forces all the other European countries to say, we'll guarantee our bank deposits. And what does that do? It turns a banking crisis into a sovereign debt crisis, which we're still with. So that's one. Then you might go to the tsunami that threatens Germany and hence requires all the nuclear power stations to be closed, right? Goodness me, that's converted Germany into the most carbon-polluting country in Europe. These are just short-termist. Why did she close all the nuclear power stations? Because the Greens went up in the opinion polls for a week, and then wow, you know? So, yeah, I think you can't afford to have such a powerful leader behave so irresponsibly.
But coming back to the main topic of culture as a key factor, or one of the factors defining the success or failure of a society, and coming back again to the issue of migration. I mean, you dealt your whole career with African states, impoverished by, apart from other factors, by migration and immigration and emigration. And on the other side, we have, take Switzerland, which became so successful because we had this kind of immigration in the 19th century and in the 20th century. So how to deal with, and I appeal to the pragmatism, how to deal with an issue you can't deny that it is existing. Or what would be a good answer, or would have been a good answer those days?
Well, I mean, I've written a whole book on how to deal with the refugee crisis with Alex Betts, who's the director of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, which is the main place. So, and in fact, we're I think next week, we've been commissioned by the European Migration Network of the European Commission to come up with a sort of way forward. So we've actually got papers that try and answer the question. And the answer we come up with is a concept of sustainable migration. And first of all, migration economic migration has to be separated out from refugees. They're very different problems. It's no good muddling them up. And the refugee issue is overwhelmingly not very much to do with asylum in Europe, right? 85% of the world's refugees are in very poor haven countries, like Jordan, where that's how we got going. We were both brought in by the government of Jordan to say, what can we do with about 1 million refugees that the West has completely neglected? You know? And so our strategy there was to say, what you've got to try and do is restore the dignity and autonomy of refugees whilst they're in these regional havens, and that, above all, means bringing jobs to them. Right? And it's got to be in the economic interest of the host government to allow these people to work and to keep the borders open with the conflict country. If the border's closed, then you've got a tragedy happening because people are trapped. And so what we should have been doing was pouring a lot of money into countries like Jordan, where all these refugees are, and then bringing work in so that people can re-establish autonomy. And instead, we got this ridiculous UNHCR policy of tents in camps, which, free food, free tent, forever, which was awful. So that was the refugee stuff. The economic migration stuff, then some migration's good. You can have too much migration and too little migration. That's what is to it. But the migration that really benefits the people left behind, and that's my criterion in all this, is it's no good imagining that the solution to Africa's poverty is to get Africans out of Africa. I mean, it is insulting as a solution and ridiculous. And the only solution is that these societies catch up. They are mainly domestic internal struggles, but there's a lot of stuff we can do to help, not least what these societies need is many more jobs, productive jobs, than they've got at the moment. And productive jobs come from people like you. You, in your sleep, perform a miracle of productivity with your employees every day because you bring people together with scale and specialization, and that is the miracle of productivity. 2/3 of Africa's human capital works solo, or in tiny micro-enterprise. No scale, no specialization, doomed. And so what Africa really, really needs is our firms. And instead it's got our NGOs.